The early morning sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees that bordered the quiet country road. The air was crisp with a faint scent of damp earth and last night's rain, carrying a chill that hinted at the approaching fall. A battered silver sedan eased along the winding lane, its tires crunching softly over gravel scattered by years of neglect. Inside, Rachel Lane stared out the window with a guarded expression, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it anchored her to this moment, the moment she'd postponed for years. The landscape blurred past, familiar yet foreign, a world she'd left behind as a child, a place she'd only dared revisit in the deepest, most restless corners of her mind. Her heart beat unevenly, a mixture of anticipation and dread. Ahead stood the old house, Margaret Lane's home, an aging two-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, darkened by time and weather. The small porch sagged under the weight of years, and the windows reflected a dullness, as if reluctant to reveal the secrets held inside. Rachel's breath hitched. After all these years, she was finally here. She turned off the engine and sat for a long moment, gathering courage. The past clawed at her with memories both tender and painful, her father's laughter fading into silence, her mother's anguished goodbye, the unanswered questions that had haunted her childhood. She had told herself this was just a break from the city, a respite from deadlines and heartache, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was here to find answers about Thomas, her father, who had vanished without a trace when she was barely 10 years old. The front door creaked open before she could reach the porch, and Margaret Lane appeared in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, skin weathered like old leather, and eyes sharp yet shadowed with years of solitude. The widow's posture was stiff, her lips pressed into a tight line as she took in the unexpected visitor. Rachel. The name was spoken with a mixture of surprise and restrained pain. You didn't say you were coming. Rachel forced a small, uneasy smile. I know. I just needed to get away for a while. Margaret's eyes narrowed briefly. After all this time. I'm sorry. Rachel's voice cracked. I should have called. Margaret said nothing, stepping aside with a curt nod that was both an invitation and a warning. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of unspoken words and old wounds that refused to heal. Inside, the house smelled of dust and faint lavender, the scent Margaret always wore. The faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and a threadbare rug covered a wooden floor scarred by decades of footsteps. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, black and white images of a younger Margaret and Edward smiling beneath a bright sun, a little boy with tousled hair, Thomas, grinning from ear to ear. These silent witnesses of a happier past seemed to watch Rachel's every move. She traced a finger along the edge of one frame, swallowing the lump in her throat. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, her movements slow but deliberate as she prepared tea. The kettle's whistle filled the quiet as Rachel sat at the table, folding and unfolding her hands nervously. I heard you were working in the city, Margaret finally said, breaking the silence. What made you come back here now? Rachel hesitated, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup. I needed to figure some things out. Margaret's gaze was steady, almost searching. About your father? Rachel nodded, unable to hide the pain behind her words. I never stopped wondering what happened to him. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set the cups down. Thomas, your father, he left to protect us. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Rachel blinked back tears. Protect us from what? Margaret looked away, her voice barely a whisper. That's a story for another time. The fragile truce between them was shattered by a sudden knock at the door. Both women startled. Margaret glanced toward the entrance but said nothing. Rachel's heart pounded as the knock came again. Insistent, almost urgent. Margaret opened the door to find a mail carrier holding a small, yellowed envelope with her name scrawled in neat handwriting. She took it silently and closed the door, the tight grip on the envelope betraying her calm exterior. Later that night, Rachel lay awake in the guest room, the muffled sounds of the countryside surrounding her like a living, breathing entity. The shadows danced on the ceiling, and memories swirled in her mind. Her father's last birthday, the way he used to laugh, the day he disappeared like smoke through her fingers. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a door creaking downstairs. Curious and restless, she slipped out of bed and crept quietly down the hall. In the living room, the dim moonlight revealed Margaret seated in her favorite armchair, clutching the envelope tightly. Rachel's eyes were drawn to a folded piece of paper slipping from the envelope's edge. Without thinking, she moved closer. "What's that?" Rachel asked softly. Margaret startled, then hesitated before holding out the letter. "It came this afternoon. For Thomas. From someone." Rachel's hands trembled as she unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, firm and flowing, yet marked by urgency. The date was 3 weeks after his disappearance. Rachel's breath caught. The letter spoke of fear, of needing to leave to keep them safe, and of a plan to meet again, one that never came. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've never shown this to anyone. I thought it was just a cruel trick." Rachel swallowed hard, a fierce determination rising within her. "It's not a trick. It's a clue." Margaret looked at her granddaughter, the years of distance softening for the first time. "Be careful, Rachel. Some things are better left buried." But Rachel already knew she couldn't turn back. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the whisper of secrets waiting to be uncovered, secrets sewn into the fabric of a coat that had held a lifetime of love and mysteries. The sun was high in the pale blue sky, but the air inside Margaret Lane's farmhouse remained cool and dim, heavy with the scent of old wood, dust, and forgotten memories. Rachel ascended the narrow, creaking staircase that led to the attic, her footsteps muffled by the faded carpet runners. The house groaned softly under the weight of its own history, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. The attic was a small, cramped space beneath the pitched roof, lit only by a grimy window that cast a dull, gray light across stacks of faded cardboard boxes, bundles of yellowed newspapers, and dusty trunks. It smelled of mothballs and aged paper, a scent that stirred something deep within Rachel, half nostalgia, half unease. She moved slowly, running her fingers over the cracked leather of an old trunk. It creaked open with a hesitant protest, revealing folded quilts, a collection of delicate lace handkerchiefs, and a faded photo album resting atop the pile. She lifted it carefully, brushing off years of dust, and opened the brittle pages. Inside were photographs frozen in time, sepia-toned images of a younger Margaret and Edward, arm in arm under sunlit skies, Thomas as a boy, his eyes sparkling with mischief, moments of laughter and family celebrations long past. Rachel's gaze lingered on a photo of Thomas clutching a bright red kite, his face flushed with joy, a stark contrast to the sorrow that had since engulfed their lives. A soft shuffle behind her startled Rachel. Turning, she saw Margaret standing at the attic's narrow doorway, her arms folded, eyes sharp and wary. "You shouldn't be up here," Margaret said quietly, voice edged with something between warning and weariness. Rachel hesitated. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to see. I wanted to understand." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "This house holds more memories than you can imagine. Some of them better left alone." But Rachel had long ago made up her mind. Margaret's gaze fell on a heavy wool coat draped over a wooden chair, a coat that seemed oddly out of place among the relics of the past. It was Edward's favorite, Rachel remembered from childhood tales, a thick, faded garment with frayed cuffs and a faint, lingering scent of cedarwood. "That coat," Rachel whispered, stepping closer. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached out, tracing the worn fabric. "It's all I have left of him." Rachel's eyes searched her grandmother's face, reading the mixture of love and loss etched into every line. "May I?" Margaret nodded silently. As Rachel lifted the coat, a loose thread caught her eye near the inside hem. Her fingers traced the subtle stitching, and then, almost by accident, she felt a slight bulge beneath the lining. Her heart quickened. With delicate care, Rachel slipped her hand inside the coat's inner pocket. The fabric was thin and fragile, but beneath it, something crinkled softly. She pulled out a small, folded envelope, yellowed with age, its edges softened by time. Margaret's breath hitched. "Where did you find that?" Rachel unfolded the envelope slowly, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakably familiar, bold, deliberate strokes that she had seen in photographs and old letters. It was Thomas's handwriting. Rachel's hands shook as she read the date scrawled at the top, 3 weeks after Thomas had disappeared. Her eyes darted over the carefully penned words. The letter spoke of fear, of needing to stay hidden, and of a promise to return when it was safe. A desperate plea to Margaret and Edward to protect Rachel. Margaret's face paled. "I never thought he could have been alive then. Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, a blend of anger and heartbreak. Margaret looked away, her voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't want to hope, only to be shattered again." Rachel folded the letter gently and tucked it back into the pocket of the coat. The room felt suffocating with the weight of the past pressing down on them. Suddenly, Margaret's eyes darkened with a sudden resolve. "There's more upstairs, things I never showed anyone. Old clippings, diaries, maybe answers you need." Rachel nodded, a fierce determination lighting her features. "Then show me." Margaret hesitated, then moved toward a dusty trunk in the corner. She knelt and opened it carefully, revealing stacks of brittle newspaper articles, faded letters, and a leather-bound journal. Together, they sifted through the contents. Headlines about a local factory fire, rumors of corruption, whispers of a scandal that had rocked their small town decades ago. Marginal notes in the journal hinted at Edward's involvement in something dangerous, a secret he had carried like a burden. Rachel's pulse quickened. Each piece of paper was a fragment of a puzzle long ignored, a story that had been buried beneath years of silence and fear. Margaret looked tired, but also strangely relieved. "I never wanted this to come to light. It might hurt more than it helps." But Rachel's voice was firm. "The truth has to come out. For all of us." As dusk crept over the horizon, the attic seemed to pulse with the ghosts of the past, whispers of love, betrayal, and sacrifices made in the shadows. The coat, once a simple garment, had become a vessel of hidden messages and unspoken stories. Downstairs, the house settled into quietude, but for Rachel and Margaret, a storm was beginning to gather. A storm that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the price of secrets. The morning light spilled softly through the faded curtains, casting a muted glow across the worn wooden floors of Margaret's living room. Outside, the trees whispered in the gentle breeze, but inside, an uneasy silence hung thick between grandmother and granddaughter. Rachel sat rigid in the faded armchair opposite Margaret, the letter from Thomas, the letter that should have never existed, pressed carefully in her hands. Its folded corners still creased from years tucked away inside the coat. The weight of its words settled over the room like a fragile, invisible thread threatening to unravel everything. Margaret's eyes were clouded, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. The steady walls of her stoic demeanor began to show cracks, as the past she'd tried to lock away came pressing through the years. Rachel's voice broke the silence, steady but edged with raw emotion. "Grandma, this letter. Why did you never tell me?" Margaret looked away, swallowing hard. "I wanted to protect you, Rachel. Sometimes, the truth, it's too heavy for a child." Rachel's gaze sharpened. "But I'm not a child anymore. I deserve to know what happened to my father." Margaret's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly. "I didn't want to hope. I was afraid it was a cruel trick, some twisted game to tear us apart again." A long pause settled between them, heavy with unspoken regrets. Rachel folded the letter gently and looked up. "Do you think it's real? That Thomas was alive after all this time?" Margaret's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. "I don't know. But I've kept faith in silence for too long. Maybe it's time to listen." As the day wore on, a restless unease stirred in Margaret's mind. Old memories, long buried beneath years of sorrow and denial, began to surface in shards, fragments she'd tried desperately to forget. That evening, the shadows deepened, casting a somber veil over the house. Margaret sat alone by the fireplace, the letter spread out on the wooden table before her. Her fingers traced the ink, as if trying to draw strength from the words. Suddenly, her mind transported her back to a time when the house was alive with laughter and light. She saw Edward and Thomas in the workshop, voices raised in a heated argument, their faces flushed with frustration and fear. The memory was sharp, vivid, Thomas accusing his father of hiding something, Edward pleading for patience. The echoes of their dispute still resonated in her heart, long after silence had claimed the room. Margaret's breath caught as she remembered Thomas's final words before walking out the door that day. Words heavy with desperation and warning. The weight of the secret they'd shared, the one she never fully understood, pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. Rachel found her grandmother the next morning in the same chair, eyes distant, haunted. "Grandma," Rachel said gently, reaching for her hand. "What happened between them?" Margaret blinked, as if waking from a long sleep. "Edward and Thomas. They argued about the factory. Thomas discovered something terrible, something Edward wanted to keep hidden. I think Edward was trying to protect him. But it drove a wedge between them." Rachel's heart pounded. "What kind of secret?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know everything. But Edward was involved in something dangerous, something that could destroy lives." Rachel's mind raced. The letter, the hidden coat pocket, the argument, it all pointed to a truth far more complex than she'd imagined. Determined to uncover more, Rachel spent the afternoon rummaging through old boxes and drawers, seeking clues that could shed light on the mystery. She found scraps of torn newspaper articles detailing a factory accident, an explosion that had claimed lives, and whispers of corruption that had never been fully investigated. Margaret watched silently as Rachel pieced together fragments of a puzzle neither of them fully understood. The quiet tension between them began to thaw, replaced by a fragile bond forged through shared pain and a mutual need for answers. As twilight fell, Rachel returned to the living room, holding a fragile photograph she'd discovered tucked inside a book. It showed Edward standing beside a group of factory workers, his expression grim, eyes shadowed by something she couldn't yet place. "Do you remember this?" Rachel asked. Margaret studied the image, nodding slowly. "That was before everything fell apart. Edward was a proud man, but that job, it changed him. I think the factory held more secrets than I ever knew." The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next piece of the story to emerge from the shadows. Before Rachel could speak again, the phone rang, sharp and unexpected in the stillness. Margaret hesitated, then answered with a trembling hand. "Hello." A pause. Then a voice, low and menacing. "Stop digging, Rachel. Some things are better left buried." The line went dead. Rachel stared at the receiver, her heart pounding. Margaret's face hardened, a steely resolve replacing the fear. "They know you're asking questions." Rachel clenched her fists. "Then we have to keep going." That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, the letter from Thomas lay open on the table, a beacon in the darkness, an invitation to uncover truths long hidden, and to confront the ghosts of a family's past that refused to stay buried. The early morning light spilled gently over the overgrown garden behind Margaret's farmhouse, casting long shadows through tangled vines and wildflowers that had grown unchecked for years. The scent of damp earth and moss mingled with the sharp tang of autumn leaves beginning to fall. Rachel stood at the garden's edge, her fingers brushing nervously against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree. She had spent the morning helping Margaret weed the beds, but her thoughts were elsewhere, drawn to the weight of the letter from Thomas and the fragments of memories stirring in the house like restless spirits. Margaret moved slowly behind her, her breath steady but measured, as if the garden itself held some sacred significance. "This place used to be my husband's sanctuary," she said softly, voice tinged with nostalgia. "Edward loved working the soil, tending to the plants, finding peace in the growing things." Rachel nodded, the faint sound of bees humming around the fading blossoms blending with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. "There's something about this garden. It feels like it holds secrets." Margaret's gaze darkened for a moment. "More than you know." As Rachel turned away from the oak, her eyes caught sight of a small shed tucked behind a thick curtain of ivy, its wood weathered and gray. The door sagged slightly on rusty hinges, the paint peeling like fragile bark. "I've never been inside there," Rachel admitted. Margaret shook her head. "Neither have I, at least, not in decades." The two women approached the shed together. The air was cooler here, shaded and still, as if time had slowed within its walls. Rachel pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the quiet garden. Inside, the musty scent of aged wood and dust enveloped them. Stacks of old tools leaned against the walls, rusted trowels, a faded watering can, and scattered among the clutter, Rachel spotted a half-buried wooden box. Margaret's eyes flickered with recognition. "I forgot that was there." Carefully, Rachel knelt and lifted the box lid, revealing a treasure trove of yellowed letters tied with twine, faded photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. Her breath caught as she picked up a photograph, a candid shot of Thomas standing arm in arm with a woman Rachel didn't recognize, a young child clinging shyly at their side. The woman's face was soft but guarded, eyes looking away from the camera as if afraid to be seen. "Who is she?" Rachel asked quietly. Margaret's voice trembled. "I don't know her name. I never met her. But I've suspected for years that Thomas had a secret life, something he kept hidden from us." Rachel's heart pounded, the fragile image challenging everything she'd believed about her father. Had Thomas truly started a new family? Had he disappeared not to escape danger, but to protect those he loved? As Rachel sifted through the letters, one slipped free from the bundle, its edges worn and fragile. She unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the faded ink. The letter was from Thomas, addressed to Margaret and Edward. Its tone was urgent and filled with sorrow. He spoke of fear, not just for himself, but for the woman and child he hoped would someday be safe. He wrote of a plan to disappear, to keep them hidden from a threat he never fully explained. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Rachel read aloud the words her son had written decades ago, a testament to love and sacrifice shrouded in silence. "I never knew," Margaret whispered. "He carried that burden alone." The strain of the past weighed heavily on Margaret's shoulders, and Rachel noticed for the first time the subtle tremor in her grandmother's hands, the flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Are you all right?" Rachel asked gently. Margaret blinked, then smiled weakly. "I'm just tired, that's all." The following days saw Margaret struggling with bouts of forgetfulness, misplaced keys, moments of disorientation that unsettled Rachel deeply. The stress of revisiting old wounds seemed to be unraveling her slowly. Determined to help, Rachel suggested they take breaks outside, to breathe fresh air and reconnect with the present. But even amidst the blooms and birdsong, the shadows of the past lingered. One afternoon, as Margaret rested on the porch, Rachel sat beside her, the leather-bound journal open between them. Margaret began to share stories, fragments of her life with Edward, memories of laughter and pain, the tension that had grown between father and son in the years before Thomas disappeared. "I always sensed something was wrong," Margaret said, voice barely above a whisper. "Edward became a different man, distant, secretive. Thomas tried to confront him, but Edward wouldn't listen." Rachel traced her fingers over a page where Edward had scribbled notes about the factory, names and dates scrawled in a hurried hand. "The factory," Rachel repeated. What was really going on there? Margaret's eyes clouded. Dangerous things. People getting hurt. Things that should have been stopped. As evening fell, a cold wind swept through the garden, shaking leaves loose and sending a chill down Rachel's spine. She looked up at Margaret, whose gaze was fixed on the horizon, distant and haunted. "We have to find out the truth," Rachel said firmly. "For Thomas, for you, for all of us." Margaret nodded slowly, the resolve in her eyes hardening. That night, as Rachel prepared to turn in, she glanced back toward the garden. The shadows stretched long and deep, the house standing silent but alive with secrets waiting to be uncovered. The coat, hanging in the hallway, seemed to watch over them, a silent sentinel holding stories of love, loss, and hidden truths that would soon come to light. The sun had barely risen when Rachel set out for Mason County, a small town just over an hour's drive from her grandmother's farmhouse. The road wound through stretches of golden fields and thick forests painted with early autumn hues, crimson, amber and burnt orange that shimmered in the morning light. Yet, despite the beauty around her, Rachel's heart thudded with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The photograph of Thomas, the unknown woman, and the child weighed heavily in her mind. She had to find answers. Who was this woman? Was she truly a part of Thomas's life? And, if so, why had Margaret never spoken her name? Mason County was quiet and unassuming, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where secrets were buried beneath polite smiles and well-tended porches. Rachel parked near a small cafe on Main Street, the autumn air crisp and fresh. She clutched the photo in her hand and hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly, and a few heads turned toward her. She approached the counter, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair wiped a coffee pot. "Excuse me," Rachel began, showing the photograph carefully. "Do you know who this is?" The woman's brow furrowed as she studied the image. That's Claire Adams. She used to live on the edge of town, years ago. Quiet woman. Kept mostly to herself. Rachel's pulse quickened. "Do you know where I might find her?" The woman hesitated, then said, "Last I heard, she still lives around here. Down by the old mill road." Thanking her, Rachel stepped back outside and navigated the narrow streets toward the outskirts of town. The old mill road was lined with tall pines and wild undergrowth, and the air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. After a few minutes, she spotted a modest white house, its paint faded and chipped, surrounded by an untamed garden. Rachel knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long pause, it creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s with soft eyes and a wary expression. "Claire Adams?" Rachel asked gently. The woman nodded, folding her arms protectively. "Yes. And you are?" "Rachel Lane. I think you knew my father." Claire's eyes flickered with surprise and something deeper, sadness, perhaps. "Come in," Claire said quietly, stepping aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Photos of a young boy and a man with familiar features adorned the shelves. Rachel's gaze softened as she took in the memories frozen in time. They sat at a worn kitchen table, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup of tea. "I knew Thomas," she began softly. "We were close." Rachel listened intently as Claire shared a story she had kept buried for decades. "Thomas and I met here, after he disappeared," Claire said, voice barely above a whisper. "He was scared, running from something he wouldn't explain. He wanted a new life, away from everything." Rachel's throat tightened. Did he ever say what he was running from? Claire looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Danger. Men who wanted to silence him. "He told me his father, Edward, helped him disappear. To keep him safe." Rachel's mind reeled. Edward, the grandfather she'd always believed was a man of quiet dignity, had been part of this secret? "Why didn't you tell my grandmother?" Rachel asked, searching Claire's face. Claire's eyes glistened with tears. "I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Thomas begged me to keep it quiet, for Rachel's sake." Rachel swallowed hard. "Did Thomas ever want to come back?" Claire nodded. "He did. He dreamed of returning one day, to make things right. But the threats never stopped." A sudden knock at the door startled them both. Claire's expression tightened. "Who was that?" Rachel asked. Claire shook her head. "No one. Just an old fear that never leaves." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years pressing down on them. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude and sorrow for the woman who had loved her father in secret, and for the child she might never know. Before Rachel left, Claire handed her a sealed envelope. "If you're reading this," she said softly, "it means I'm gone. Inside, you'll find more about your father, his hopes, his fears. I want you to have it." Rachel clutched the envelope tightly as she stepped back into the fading daylight, the photograph burning in her mind like a beacon. The road home stretched before her, winding through shadows and sunlight, as she carried not just memories, but the heavy burden of a family's hidden past, waiting to be unraveled. The weight of the leather-bound journal lay heavy in Margaret's lap, its cracked spine and worn pages speaking of years of secrets kept and battles fought in silence. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the dimly lit sitting room. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself was mourning the ghosts of the past. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the journal, hesitant yet compelled by the need to understand the man she had loved, and the truth she'd long avoided. The first entries were sparse, written in Edward's steady hand, chronicling days spent at the factory where he worked as a supervisor. The words began innocently enough, reports on machinery, notes on schedules, and the occasional mention of workers' complaints. But as the pages turned, a darker picture emerged. Edward wrote of hazardous conditions, faulty equipment, and corners cut to increase profits at the expense of safety. The tone grew urgent, laced with fear and frustration. He detailed near misses, injuries hidden from the public eye, and whispers of a looming disaster. Margaret's heart ached as she read Edward's internal struggle, his loyalty to the factory clashing with his growing horror at the corruption and danger he witnessed daily. One entry stood out, a chilling account dated just weeks before Thomas disappeared. Edward wrote of a plan to expose the factory's dangerous practices, but he feared the consequences. The truth must come out, the entry read. But at what cost? There are forces here willing to silence those who speak. Rachel sat beside Margaret, the tension between them palpable. She reached out, placing a steady hand on her grandmother's. "Do you think Edward was trying to protect us?" Rachel asked softly. Margaret nodded slowly. He was a proud man. But he was trapped, torn between doing what was right and keeping his family safe. The journal revealed that Thomas had discovered evidence of the factory's illegal activities, threatening powerful people with everything to lose. Edward, desperate to shield his son, had helped Thomas vanish, an act of love and sacrifice born of fear. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she whispered, "He lied to me, to protect us all." Rachel's grip tightened. "We need to know more. Who were these people? What exactly happened?" Margaret's gaze darkened. "That's where the danger lies." Determined to uncover the full story, Rachel spent days researching the factory scandal, digging through old newspapers, court records, and town archives. The pieces began to fall into place, a tangled web of bribery, cover-ups, and lives lost in a preventable fire. She found names of men who'd been silenced, threatened, vanished, or worse. The factory had been a powder keg, and Edward and Thomas had been caught in the blast. One evening, Margaret and Rachel sat together in the kitchen, the journal open between them. Margaret recounted Edward's final years, how the burden of secrets weighed heavily on him, how his health declined under the strain. "He carried the guilt alone," Margaret said, voice breaking. "He thought if he protected us by hiding the truth, it would keep the danger away." Rachel's eyes burned with a fierce resolve. But the truth can't stay buried forever. Just then, the phone rang, shattering the fragile peace. Margaret answered, her hand shaking. A cold, unfamiliar voice whispered on the other end, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Margaret's face paled, but her eyes shone with steely determination. "They're still watching." Rachel met her grandmother's gaze. "Then we fight back." Together, they prepared to confront the shadows of the past, knowing that uncovering the truth could change everything, but refusing to let fear silence them any longer. The small town of Ashford lay nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, a place where everyone knew each other's names, or at least thought they did. Rachel drove slowly through its quiet streets, the weight of hope and fear pressing heavily on her chest. Every mile brought her closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The fading autumn light cast long shadows across the storefronts and shuttered windows. Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled up in front of a modest house on Maple Street, a place she'd learned belonged to a man named Daniel Hayes. According to her research, Daniel was a quiet, solitary figure, well known locally but with a past as obscured as the rumors swirling around him. Rachel stepped out of the car, clutching a folder filled with clippings, photographs, and the letters she'd gathered from her grandmother's attic. She hesitated before the front door, heart pounding. What if this was a dead end? Or worse, what if Daniel was truly her father, living a life of silence and lies? The door opened before she could knock. A man in his late 50s, his face lined with the weariness of years lived on the edge, stared at her. His eyes held a flicker of recognition, but his expression was guarded. "Yes?" he asked cautiously. "I'm Rachel Lane," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I believe you knew my father, Thomas." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't know anyone by that name." Rachel felt a flush of frustration. "There's a lot you're not telling me, isn't there?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his scruffy beard. "Look, I don't want trouble. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand." For a long moment, the man seemed to wrestle with himself. Then, unexpectedly, a slip of familiarity escaped his lips, a nickname only her father would have used. Rachel's breath caught. "Did you just say, Red?" The man's eyes widened in shock. He looked away, voice low. "That's what we called him. But that was a long time ago." Rachel's mind reeled. The possibility that this man was her father hovered just beyond confirmation. "Why did you disappear?" she asked gently. "Why did you leave us?" The man's jaw tightened. "To keep you safe. There were things happening. Dangerous things. I had no choice." Rachel's emotions tangled, anger, relief, confusion. "I've spent years wondering if you were alive. If you cared." He looked at her, eyes glistening. "I never stopped caring. I stayed away because I had to." Rachel's heart ached with the weight of unspoken years. "Can you come home? To us?" The man shook his head slowly. "I'm not the man I used to be. But I want you to know the truth. Someday, when the time is right." Rachel nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll wait for that day." As she drove back to her grandmother's house, the sky darkened and rain began to fall, a quiet cleansing that mirrored the storm of emotions swirling inside her. When Rachel arrived, Margaret was waiting on the porch, worry etched into her weathered face. "Did you find him?" Margaret asked softly. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I think I did." Margaret reached out, taking Rachel's hand. "Then we have hope." But the fragile peace was shattered the next day by an anonymous call, one filled with threats and warnings. The danger was far from over. Together, Rachel and Margaret steeled themselves for the journey ahead, determined to unravel the tangled threads of their family's past, no matter the cost. The late afternoon sun was dipping behind the hills as Rachel drove down the winding road leading to the remote town of Silver Creek. Nestled among towering pines and rugged cliffs, Silver Creek was a place whispered about for its quiet isolation, and for the secrets it seemed to guard jealously. Rachel's heart pounded as she approached a weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. The chipped paint and sagging porch gave it a forgotten, almost abandoned look. This was the address she had uncovered after days of careful digging. A man who matched the description, the age, and the mannerisms of her father. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the rough wooden door, the sound echoing into the stillness. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with sharp, wary eyes and a face etched with lines of hardship and regret. His salt and pepper hair was unkempt, and his clothes hung loosely on his lean frame. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice rough but controlled. Rachel swallowed her fear. "I'm Rachel Lane. I believe you might be my father." His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a heartbeat, the silence stretched like a fragile thread between them. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally, turning away. Rachel stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. "Please," she urged. "I've come a long way. I need to know the truth." He sighed heavily, his gaze flickering toward a faded photograph pinned to the wall. A younger man with bright eyes, unmistakably her father. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "I'm not the man you're looking for." Rachel's throat tightened. "But you're the only man who fits the story," the man who disappeared. He turned back to her, eyes shadowed. I left to protect you. To protect everyone I cared about. Rachel took a step closer. Why? What were you protecting us from? The man's expression faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability broke through the guarded exterior. There were people after me, dangerous people tied to that factory scandal. They wanted to silence me. Permanently. Rachel's breath caught. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you leave without a word? He looked away, voice thick with regret. I thought if I stayed, they'd come after you and your grandmother. I had to disappear. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I needed you. He reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as it brushed her cheek. I never stopped loving you. I stayed away because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. The room felt heavy with years of pain and unspoken words. Suddenly, he paused, his eyes sharp with sudden realization. There's something I need to tell you, something I couldn't say before. Rachel leaned in, heart racing. The factory scandal was worse than you know. It wasn't just corruption, there were threats, violence. People died because of it. I stayed hidden because the danger isn't gone. Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his confession. I want to come home, she whispered. I want to rebuild what we lost. He smiled sadly. One step at a time. As Rachel left the cabin, the sky was painted in twilight hues, pink, purple, and fading gold. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, hope flickered in her heart. Back at Margaret's farmhouse, Rachel shared everything with her grandmother. Tears and embraces mingled as the fractured family took their first tentative steps toward healing. But the shadows lingered, silent threats in the dark reminding them that some secrets were never truly buried. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of Margaret's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug beneath their feet. The house was quiet, too quiet, save for the steady ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. It was a fragile calm, the kind that comes before a storm, or perhaps before a long-awaited reckoning. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The coat, Edward's old wool coat, hung solemnly on the nearby coat rack, its faded fabric carrying decades of memories. Rachel stood beside her, clutching a small, weathered envelope they had just discovered hidden within the coat's lining. Margaret's breath caught as she carefully unfolded the letter inside. The paper was fragile and yellowed with age, edges soft from years of folding and unfolding. The handwriting was unmistakable, Edward's familiar script, looping and deliberate. Rachel's eyes widened. It's from Grandpa. Margaret nodded, voice trembling. It's the last letter he ever wrote. She began to read aloud, her voice soft but steady, carrying the weight of every word. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. I have carried burdens too heavy to share, but now I must tell you the truth, our truth. Thomas's disappearance was not what it seemed. He was in danger, tangled in something far darker than we imagined. The factory scandal was only the surface. Corruption ran deep, and the shadows reached farther than I feared. I helped him vanish because I loved him and feared for his life, and for yours and Rachel's. I lied to protect you all, but in doing so, I lost a part of myself. I am sorry for the silence, the secrets, and the pain. Know that every choice I made was out of love. Forgive me. Margaret's voice broke as she finished. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as Rachel reached out, taking her grandmother's hands in hers. The room seemed to hold its breath, the walls echoing with the echoes of a life lived in shadow. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. Why did he keep all of this from us? Margaret sighed, the weight of years etched into her weary face. Fear. Shame. The hope that by hiding the truth, he could shield us from harm. But it only made the pain worse, Rachel said, anger and sorrow mingling in her words. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. Silence can be as cruel as betrayal. As they sat together, sharing memories and tears, the doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Margaret moved slowly to answer it, revealing a young man holding a battered envelope. "Delivery for Rachel Lane," he said, handing it over with a polite nod before disappearing down the path. Rachel took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy, black-and-white image of Edward and Thomas standing side by side, younger and happier, framed by the smokestacks of the factory in the background. On the back was a message, scrawled hastily, "The truth lies beneath. Follow the coat's thread." Rachel looked up at her grandmother, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Margaret's gaze hardened. "We're not done yet." Together, they began to unravel the final layers of the mystery, searching for what Edward had hidden beneath the surface, in places only the coat could lead them. That night, as the house settled into silence, the legacy of silence itself was finally broken, bringing with it a bittersweet hope for healing, and a promise that the truth, however painful, would no longer be buried. The morning light was soft and pale, filtering through the curtains of Margaret's modest farmhouse like a gentle promise. The house seemed suspended in time, a place where memories lingered like fragile whispers, waiting to be heard. For Rachel, the past and present had collided in a way she could never have imagined, threading together decades of love, secrets, and sacrifice. Margaret sat quietly in her favorite armchair, the old coat draped carefully over the back. The fabric was worn and faded, each stitch a testament to a lifetime of stories and silent burdens. Rachel stood nearby, her hands clenched tightly, heart pounding with anticipation and trepidation. Today, everything was about to change. The moment Rachel had been waiting for, half a lifetime of unanswered questions, was finally here. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. A man older, wearier than the photographs and letters had suggested, yet unmistakably familiar. Thomas. His eyes, deep and haunted, scanned the room. When they landed on Rachel, a flicker of something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of hope, regret, and longing. Rachel's breath caught. "Dad." Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of years evident in his weary smile. "Rachel." Margaret rose unsteadily, her gaze meeting her son's with a complexity of emotions, joy, sorrow, and the ache of lost time. "Welcome home," she whispered. The three of them sat together, the silence heavy but filled with unspoken understanding. Thomas's presence brought a whirlwind of questions, but also a fragile hope that healing could begin. After a moment, Thomas spoke, his voice low and measured. "I owe you the truth, the full truth about everything." He recounted the story of the factory scandal in detail, the greed, the cover-ups, the threats that had forced him into hiding. Lives had been lost, including friends and colleagues who had tried to expose the truth alongside him and Edward. The danger was real and persistent, stretching far beyond what they had imagined. "I stayed away to protect you," Thomas said, looking at Rachel and Margaret. "I couldn't risk putting you in harm's way." Rachel swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "But we needed you." Thomas nodded, remorse shadowing his face. "I know. I've missed so much, your birthdays, your milestones, the chance to be a father." Margaret reached out, taking his hand gently. "You did what you thought was right." The room felt charged with emotion, pain and forgiveness, loss and hope entwined like threads in a tapestry. Thomas continued, revealing the final piece of the puzzle, a secret network of allies who had helped him stay hidden and gather evidence to bring the corrupt to justice. The fight wasn't over, but with their family reunited, there was strength in their truth. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Rachel and Margaret helped Thomas settle in, the house once heavy with silence now alive with cautious optimism. Later that evening, as twilight bathed the room in a warm glow, Margaret sat alone, the coat wrapped gently around her shoulders. Her breathing was slow and peaceful, a serene smile touching her lips. Rachel found her grandmother moments later, her eyes closed as if in a deep, restful sleep. "Grandma," Rachel whispered. Margaret's hand lifted weakly, clutching Rachel's. "I'm ready," she said softly. Margaret passed away quietly, the coat a final embrace that held a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and secrets. The days that followed were a mixture of sorrow and celebration, a farewell to a matriarch who had guarded her family's legacy with fierce love. Rachel inherited the coat, now a sacred symbol of their family's journey, a vessel of stories both beautiful and painful, a reminder that love endures even in the face of silence and sacrifice. As Rachel folded the coat carefully, she felt a profound connection to her past and a newfound strength for the future. The threads of her family's story were woven deep within her, guiding her toward healing and hope. Standing on the porch, Rachel gazed out at the horizon, where the sun was rising, bright and steady. The final thread had been woven, and with it came the promise of a new beginning.